Ride the Tide Collective podcast, where we equip ambitious professionals to strategize and take action to advance their career. My name is Julia, and I'll be your host today, and we are going to be discussing your incompetent boss. Unfortunately, this is an area that I have quite a bit of experience in, and I'm looking forward to sharing some of my tips and tricks. But before that, I want to make sure that we determine that your boss is actually incompetent. Once we can figure that out, then I'm going to share some of my main tips for managing your incompetent boss. Full disclosure, I pulled this list from a Forbes article, and I will link that article in the show notes. While I'm absolutely confident about my experience and knowledge, I also like to reference other experts and bring in multiple perspectives because my perspective is not the only perspective out there. First, we want to determine, is your boss out of touch? Do they know what's happening in your area? If they don't, then that is definitely a sign of incompetence. What might happen is they might agree with the members of the team and act like they know what's happening, but at the end of the day, they really have no idea what anybody is talking about. I have been in situations, unfortunately, where my manager addressed a large group of people in the organization and did not make any sense and did not share the right information because they were out of touch with what was happening. So very, very unfortunate in that situation, especially when you are part of the team and you have to explain it later. The next thing that we want to think about in terms of an incompetent boss is, do they stop or block energy? A lot of times in an effort to gain control, they will put ridiculous rules on their team, on their employees, or policies that basically impede the work of the team. And the idea around that is they don't want the team to move forward too quickly or without them. So it's a fear that your boss has of being left behind that really manifests itself in an iron fist, which is really unfortunate if you have a high functioning or high performing team to hold them back because of your own insecurities and fears or their own insecurities and fears. They end up doing your job instead of their own. I think this is a huge red flag of an incompetent boss when they aren't sure of their role or they haven't grown into their role, which that can go away eventually, but they might try to take on your role. And so this allows them to feel powerful, but it's going to frustrate you because you can't do your job and you end up having to either be the boss or have a confrontation with them in a respectful way, of course, that you might not want to have. They stop making sense. So this is very similar to being out of touch. This is when your boss just does not make any sense. This can happen when they are confused about their role or where they belong, but it can also happen if they have health issues, and so it's important to know the difference. And obviously in those situations, we do want to have empathy, but we also want to be aware of what is going on. The final test of whether or not you have an incompetent boss is whether or not they have any ideas. Are they contributing anything to the team or the organization? If your manager is struggling, they're not going to have time for new ideas. They're going to be so busy trying to survive that their creativity, their bigger picture vision is going to suffer. This is very common in new managers who are learning their place and their role. But if you have a seasoned manager that is struggling with this, then it is definitely a red flag for incompetence. Now what? We've gone through the list of factors to figure out whether or not your boss is incompetent. If they are actually incompetent, if you went through that list with me and thought to yourself, wow, my boss checks all of those boxes and they really are incompetent. Here are my 3 main tips for managing an incompetent boss. The first tip is have all the facts. I cannot stress this enough. You have to have the facts. So, are they a new manager? If they're a new manager, you need to cut them some slack because they might not have the skills yet and they might seem incompetent, but it's just because they don't know. You don't know what you don't know. So give them a little bit of grace in the beginning. But if you're 6 months to a year in of them being in their role, then they definitely should have it together in some fashion. Do you know the expectations that were put on them from their boss? So sometimes we don't always know what's coming down from the top. And as a manager of people, that can be really stressful. So if your manager has a lot of expectations or really high expectations put on them that they're not sure they're going to meet, that can be a stressful situation that creates a level of incompetence for them. Have you unfairly put expectations on your manager that they don't know about? I think this is a really big check for us as employees. I actually did this to one of my managers and I had to check myself. I had to do some internal work to figure out, is this actually their job, or do I have expectations of a leader and a manager that they're never going to meet? And for me, what I did in that situation is I took those expectations and then I looked for that in my next role. So finding the right manager was really important for me when I moved on from my incompetent one. Another internal look that you can take for yourself is, are you creating a story in your head because it makes you right? So I know I like to be right as much as I can. And what I would do is I would twist and shift a situation to make it sound like I was right in that situation. And that's not okay. That goes along with putting expectations on somebody and they don't know about it, right? So again, you have to check yourself. You have to make sure that whatever situation has happened, you are getting the facts and you're not letting your emotions or your own insecurities get in the way. Have you communicated clearly? I have found that sometimes as an employee, I have to communicate my expectations. I have to communicate my needs to my manager just as much as they have to communicate to me. If you haven't had that conversation, then that is a conversation that I would definitely set up with your manager. Is your boss a trigger for something deeper that I haven't managed yet? So again, this was something else that I went through where my boss was a trigger for me because my boss was intimidated by me. My manager was intimidated by me. And that was hard for me to swallow because I didn't want to be the bad guy. And that's how I felt. I felt like I was the villain and everybody looked at me like, why are you being so mean to them? Which I wasn't being mean, but I was very critical of my boss because they weren't leading the team and the department well. I had to deal with those internal issues of the villain. And oh man, that can be a completely other podcast about that. But, that is something you want to figure out. Is there a trigger? Is there a trigger inside of you that this person sets off? Think about daddy issues, mommy issues, your own insecurities. These are things you might have to manage. And then, was your boss rude, mean, or inappropriate in any exchanges that you've had? These are factual things. And if you're not being treated well, that is a completely different discussion. And we're going to talk about that in my third tip. But if your boss is rude, mean, or inappropriate with you, then we definitely need to get that reported. And I'm going to expand on that in just a minute. My second tip is to have empathy. And I think that this is really hard when you are frustrated and you feel like your boss is not doing their job well. You feel like they have no idea what they're doing. It's really hard to have empathy, but I cannot stress it enough. And here's why. I was in a situation with a boss who had some pretty significant health issues that I didn't know about and most people didn't know about. And I was actually told by somebody else about the health issues. My boss never told me. But as soon as I found out about that, my level of empathy went through the roof because I had context and I understood, oh my gosh, this person physically suffers almost every day of their life. And I felt horrible. It was such an eye-opening experience to me to learn to have empathy when you don't know the whole picture. Now, when it comes to health issues, it's a little dicey because there are a lot of laws and legal protections, so you can't expect somebody to share, but your mindset has to be that you don't know the entire picture. If you don't know their situation, then you need to try to have empathy. Again, are they new in their role? Have some empathy for that. Have some grace while they're transitioning into that new role. One other thing to think about, and I think that this gets overlooked a lot, have they recently gone through a personal tragedy or a major change? I can attest to personal tragedy. I lost both my parents within 2 years of each other, and that really impacted my work because I had to be gone and I was managing people at the time. And so it was a really rough time for me to be present at work, but also to manage what was going on in my family, along with dealing with all of the emotions of a personal tragedy. If you know that something like that has happened, again, have empathy. And then the major change, this could be a move. It could be maybe they got married, they had a baby, they adopted a kid. I mean, any type of major change can impact somebody because it means that their mind is taken up in a lot of different directions. Have empathy. Make sure that you understand the situation. Now, here's my caveat for that. You can have empathy, but if you are tracking your interactions with your boss and it's really consistent over time, that's different. Now you have a case. So that goes into my third tip, which is document, document, document. If you are really struggling, if you believe that your boss really should not be in their position or something needs to change, you need to document. So keep a notebook or electronic notes separate from your work files that document the date, the situation, and what was said or done in as much detail as possible. Another thing that is really great about documenting is it helps you think about whether or not the situation was appropriate for documentation, because sometimes we overreact due to our own situations and our own bias. And this is also what happened to me. I went to go document situations and I typed it out and I thought about it and I could feel my frustration and I could feel my anger that was coming from a different place. And when I wrote it out and I read it back to myself a couple of days later, I was like, you're being ridiculous. Like, you just have to learn how to communicate better with this person. That's another reason to start documenting situations. But again, as I said earlier, if your boss is rude or mean, if they're making really awful statements to you or even somebody that you know, you want to get that documented down so that you can turn it in. Because if you get to a point where you think you need to report a situation, they will ask for documentation and you want to have all the information possible to submit to them. And I hate to say this, but if it gets to a situation where you have to bring a lawyer in, the lawyer's also going to want that documentation. So document, document, document as much as you can. If you are in a situation with an incompetent boss, I feel for you. I have been there. If managing this situation becomes too much of a burden and you're ready to move on, check out our website, ridethetidecollective.com, for resources that will help you set yourself up for success in career advancement. This isn't something that you can just on a whim decide to do. Advancing in your career or even making a lateral move into another position takes time, and you don't want to derail your career or set yourself back because you haven't done the work now. I always stress to people not to make an emotional career decision. So if you are in a high stress situation where you're frustrated with your boss, start doing some of that work now so that when you get to a point that you want to transition, it's not going to be because you're in a heightened emotional state. If you're looking for additional support, you can also join our Facebook group. Just search Ride the Tide Collective, and we would love to interact with you and have you join in our discussions.